Is that bird gonna murder me? I don't know if that was good or bad, but it ate me. Okay, this bird was a slot machine. This game is weird. I mean, it's a Bonk game, they all are, but still. Super Bonk 2. The pinnacle of bonking technology, as this was kinda the last one released. Okay, that's strictly speaking not 100% true. There was a mobile game, and there was kind of like a reboot on the PS2 GameCube, but I think that was more like a remake of the first game. I've never played it, but I can tell you there was a huge gap of time between this and that, and for the longest time, this really was it. It is effectively a sequel to the original Super Bonk, although I'm not super familiar with that game. Honestly, I've only got the Game Boy trilogy as well as this game. But I will say that this is one of the nicest Bonk experiences I've played. The story, for what little there is, follows Bonk trying to track down this weird Death Star looking thing and ultimately having to fight the King Dragon Dinosaur guy that's the villain of every other Bonk game. And, well, that's it, really. There is a little bit of, like, in-world storytelling around World 5 that kind of develops the plot a little bit, but it's very, very brief. Overall, this game tends to focus more on just a solid standard platforming experience, rather than a big story-filled epic. And, you know, that might not be all that groundbreaking or anything, but there's a lot that can be said about just a very simple but functional platformer. Because, let's be honest, there were a lot of Me Too platformers on the Super Nintendo, and a lot of them either tried to be gimmicky or just tried to be edgy and not really substantive, whereas Bonk, he doesn't really do either of those things, but he does deliver a relatively just simple, solid experience. And, you know, when your competition is always trying to do something different, or, you know, just trying to stand out because we're just that damn cool, you know, when your character can just say, hey, we've got a good, solid experience here, that is in and of itself fairly noteworthy. Bonk as a character has a fairly simple repertoire of abilities. He can run, he can jump, he can bonk, he can multi-bonk in the air, which gives him a sort of faux hover, but if you try and use this as an attack, your hitbox is kind of weirdly 50-50 on it, so, you know, good luck if you actually plan on killing something with your hover attack. He can also climb, as well as, like, sort of flip over walls that are above him in certain situations, which gives him a little bit of movement options as well, which is nice. But again, his abilities are not really all that different from any other Bonk game. And like every other Bonk game, his skill set is mostly bolstered by power-ups, and this game has a fair number of them. You have, of course, the classic Angry Volcano Bonk, where if you bonk the ground, you create a giant wave of flame in front of you, burning anything in your path. You've got this weird Gecko Bonk, which allows him to grab items at a distance through walls and even transition through ceilings a lot easier with his big expandable tongue. You have the most adorable Super Ballerina Bonk, who is just a darling and can pirouette to victory, as well as Hobo Thief Bonk, who can throw the little smiley collectible things like shurikens, and I never got very much use out of this, as well as finally the flying like ostrich chicken Bonk, which allows you to fly past stages and is probably the most functionally useful out of the lot. Now there are two other power-ups in this game. However, they're relegated solely to bonus stages. For some reason, all the bonus stages are designed around basically giving you a challenge to complete around your power-ups. The other two that are relegated specifically to this are Tiny Bonk, who shouts a lot, and I didn't figure this out for a very long time because standard Bonk never uses the Y button, but some of his power-ups do. It's a little bit inconsistent, picking up on that's a bit awkward. As well as Big, Angry, Creepy-looking, Deformed Tank Bonk, who is basically unstoppable and is a lot of fun to play as. In fact, I was really hoping this guy would show up at some point during the campaign, and he just doesn't. These minigames themselves allow you to get extra points depending on how well you do, and if you complete them, you also get extra lives, and this can be a great way to bolster your ability to, you know, not die and game over, because game overing in this game kind of sucks a little bit. The game is divided into worlds, each world containing 3 stages, and if you game over at any point, you get sent to the start of the world. Early on, this is not a problem, however, later on, when the more difficult stages and kind of the wonky difficulty curve this game has kicks in, well, that's when things get a little bit bad. And I shouldn't say difficulty curve, because this game is a relatively easy game for the most part. There's not really a difficulty curve. It's a pretty much flat line of simplicity, but the last two stages get really, really hard, and not necessarily because they're, trying to challenge you and challenge what you've learned in your experiences in this game so far, as much as they are more or less just as easy as all the other stages. However, the last two worlds are just significantly longer than the rest. Like, seriously, prior to the fifth world, all the other stages probably take maybe at most 5 minutes to clear. Once you get to the fifth world, every stage takes 10-20 minutes to clear. It gets kind of excessively long, and of course there's no game over checkpoints between these, so when you lose in the last two worlds, it is a huge demoralizing waste of time. When I streamed this initially, I ended up getting walled on the boss of World 5, and we'll talk about him in a sec, but, I ended up really just feeling like, I don't have to record this all in one sitting. If I game over one more time, I'm done. Just because I was getting so annoyed with how long these latter two worlds were taking. Which is a shame, because the first stage in World 5 really does feel like a great final level. It really does test sort of all your abilities, and while this game doesn't really have a difficulty curve per se, I would say this was the first real step in testing the abilities I'd learned and used in the game. It really did feel like a really good final level, but everything around it afterwards just felt like a huge amount of time wastiness, especially if you lost. And let's talk about that boss of World 5, because he is pretty awful. Maybe it's just me, but this guy was terrible to fight. All the other bosses up to this point were absolutely great, but this guy, he's a little bit awkward. First of all, you have to fight him on a treadmill, and if you get knocked off, you die, which is, instant death bosses are never something I'm a fan of. But what's even better is he has this ability where he'll go to the center of the stage and just flip gravity and take the floor out from underneath you. So to counter this, you have to sort of jump at the right time. Now, that wouldn't be a problem, except that you're on a treadmill, which means that you're trying to stay as far away from the sides as possible, i.e., you're trying to stand in the center of the stage as much as you can, which is exactly where he is. Which means when you jump to try and, avoid falling to your death because the floor just dropped from underneath you, you're going to run into him, hit his invulnerability hitbox, and get repelled down into the dirt faster. This guy likes to ram you basically into the ground using your own power, and while I think that's kind of clever in its own right, it's more frustrating than anything when you realize his actual face is his entire damage point. In fact, when I ended up fighting this guy, I found that the easiest way to fight him was not the way he was intended, but rather to really understand how wonky some of the hitboxes in this game are, because you can sort of hit his, repel points, and if you hit that exact same point a second time pretty much instantaneously, you'll go through it, and you'll hit him. And that's how I ended up taking this guy down. Not through, understanding how this boss fight was actually supposed to be done, but really just abusing the hitboxes. And while I can commend any game that makes me sort of learn how it works on a deeper level just by playing it, because, I'm that guy, when your best strategy to taking out a boss is entirely unintentional, you may have made a bad boss. In fact, I can further point out this is probably a bad boss, and the difficulty curve at this point, or lack thereof, is a little strange, because there's still 3 bosses after this guy, and they are cake compared to this guy. This guy is dumb hard, and everything after this is an absolute joke in terms of difficulty. It's weird. Speaking of bosses, there is something boss related that actually encourages you to go explore the worlds, which I do really kind of appreciate this. Every stage in a world has a collectible. It's different depending on the worlds. In the first one it was magical chaos emeralds, in World 5 it was cockroaches. It's a bit variable, but for every one you collect, when you encounter the boss, they will sort of jump out of your non-existent inventory and attack the boss. The fact that the collectibles in the stage and the exploration of the stage come back to pay off in fighting the boss is really quite cool. I like that a lot. And, well, that's Super Bonk 2, really. It's not an overly complicated game, and it relies heavily on sort of its weirdness and its power-ups more than anything for a lot of draw. Because, like I said at the top, this isn't necessarily a game that stands out as being all that particularly different or interesting, so much as it just devotes itself to being a very standard, well-made, very simple, standard, functional platformer. And in a world where everyone's trying to be standout and different, just making a solid very simple, playable game is, in and of itself, something I like to commend a lot. Because I've noticed that when I was playing a lot of, like, Mario Maker, is like, everyone wants to make, like, a big fancy thing that's completely different than everyone else. They want to make something that just blows people's minds, and no one wants to just make a good, functional level, or they just want to copy Nintendo's levels. Seriously, Mario Maker 2 is kind of a mess like that. User-generated content games. They be like that, much to my chagrin. But Super Bonk 2 is damn good. The overall presentation of Super Bonk 2 is solid. Visually, I quite like this game a lot. It's bright, it's got high vibrance. It reminds me, visually, just in its use of color, a little bit of Super Widget, which, man, I gotta talk about Super Widget at some point. But either way, it looks really, really good. There's a lot of animation, like, a lot of animation. Like, oh my god, there's so much animation in this game. Take this one move that isn't immediately well taught to you. You can sort of slide under these one block tall things, and there's an animation for sliding underneath it and picking yourself up and your bloody nose for dragging your face into the dirt. But it's a little bit of an awkward move. You have to build up speed to it and time it right, or else you fall flat on your face doing nothing, or you ram into the wall, both of which have their own animations. There's also, of course, the standard trying to not fall off a platform animation, as well as a bunch of other things. And pretty much every transformation has their own set of animations for pretty much all of this. They really went all out when it came to the animation in this game, trying to make it almost feel like sort of a playable cartoon of sorts. Bonk is a very animated character with a ton of personality, and I think that's great. You know, compared to all the other ones who are, no, we're definitely edgy, trust us, you know. Get out of here, Arrow the Acrobat, with your stupid sunglasses. You're not edgy. You're not cool. Look at Bonk, he's cool. And the audio design it does what it needs to do. I don't think the audio is near as standout as the visuals, but I will say that it works for what it needs to do, and it works well. Although I honestly don't think all that much is terribly memorable about it. The soundtrack itself is absolutely fine, leading to an absolutely solid presentation. Now, if you want a copy of Super Bonk 2, or Super Genjin 2, as I should accurately call it, because it was never actually released in North America, cheapest one on eBay at this moment is $31, shipping included. And that's not a bad price for this game. Like I said, it's not the most standout platform ever. It doesn't do anything that, you know, will make you say, hey, look at this game because it's so much different than everything else. It's just a standard platformer, but it's a really well done one. Minus the boss of World 5, screw that guy. But I have to thank the patron saint of awesome game donations and mechas, JetWolf68K, for sending this in his big awesome box, because this is a game I've been trying to get for years. Like, literally all the way back to when I started this show and I got, like, my terrible Retron 3 and I could play Super Famicom stuff. This was one I'd been trying to get. In fact, I tried to buy this game probably about 24 times, and every time I try and get it, you know, it just slipped through my fingers, so to speak. But for $30, I would say this is a pretty solid platformer. If you're going out and buying these games, there are some very standard, decent platformers in North America that cost a hell of a lot more than this. If you're capable of playing Super Famicom games and you want a decent platformer, this one's this. It's not that stand out, and it does seem to have an incomplete translation. I tried to apply a translation patch to this, and it was a bit hit or miss. Not everything was translated, and the stuff that was a little bit visually garbled at times, but it was, you know, decent. It's Bonk. It doesn't have a lot of text it needs to translate, so you don't even need a translation for this. That's the great thing about this game, too. You know, just, it's ready to pick up and play if you want to play these sort of games. It's got some issues. The Stage 5 boss is a bit of an ass, and, you know, the bonus stages, they run very long for what they reward you with, and they are a little bit difficult. I actually had a lot of trouble with the bonus stages, minus the one with the ostrich power-up, which even has some, like, decoy stuff you can't interact with, and they don't tell you about that. It's not a perfect game by any means, but it is just a good, solid, fun platformer with some creepy, weird, wonky moments that will probably stick in your mind. Like, seriously, you have to get eaten by a bird to activate a slot machine in its stomach to get pooped out to get power-ups sometimes. That's the kind of game we're dealing with right now. Super Bonk 2, it's weird, but it's a good, solid platformer, and, you know, I appreciate that. Good for you, Bonk.